300 feet beneath the cold waters of the Irish Sea lies a ship that changed the course of World War I. The official story is simple. A German U-boat torpedoed a civilian passenger liner. 1,198 innocent people died. The world was outraged. America nearly entered the war. Justice was served. But that story is a lie. In 2024, an underwater drone equipped with penetrating sonar technology did something no one had been allowed to do for 109 years. It opened the cargo holds that Britain swore contained nothing but cheese, furs, and commercial goods. May 1st, 1915, the RMS Lusitania prepared to depart New York Harbor on what should have been a routine transatlantic crossing. At 787 feet long, she was one of the fastest and most luxurious ocean liners in the world. She'd made this journey 201 times before without incident, but this crossing was different. 2 days before departure, the German embassy did something unprecedented. They placed a warning in 50 American newspapers. The notice was blunt. It stated that the waters around Great Britain were a war zone, that vessels flying the flag of Britain or her allies were liable to destruction, that travelers sailing in those waters did so at their own risk. The warning ran directly beside Cunard Line's advertisement for the Lusitania's departure. Most passengers dismissed it as propaganda. This was a civilian ship. International law protected passenger vessels. Germany wouldn't dare attack innocent travelers. Charles Frohman, a famous Broadway producer, reportedly laughed at the suggestion of danger. Why fear death? It is the most beautiful adventure in life, he said. He boarded anyway. So did 1,266 other passengers, including 129 Americans. Along with 696 crew members, the Lusitania carried 1,962 souls when she steamed out of New York on May 1st, 1915. What those passengers didn't know was what else was loaded in the cargo holds below their feet. The manifest listed the cargo as cheese, furs, beef, and commercial goods. Standard supplies for wartime Britain, nothing unusual, nothing dangerous. The ship's captain, William Thomas Turner, had his orders from the British Admiralty: maintain speed through dangerous waters, zigzag to avoid U-boats, follow strict protocols. On May 7, 1915, those orders would prove worthless. The morning of May 7th dawned clear and calm off the southern coast of Ireland. The Lusitania was running parallel to the coastline, just 11 miles offshore. Passengers were finishing lunch, some strolled the decks. Children played, the mood was relaxed. Captain Turner had reduced speed to 18 knots due to heavy fog earlier that morning. The Admiralty had sent multiple warnings. German U-boats were active in the area. He should have been zigzagging. He was not. At 10 in the afternoon, Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, commander of German submarine U-20, spotted the Lusitania through his periscope. He was nearly out of torpedoes, down to just 3 after a successful week-long patrol. The massive ship was attempting a target to pass up. Schwieger lined up his shot. At 10 p.m., he gave the order, fire. The torpedo struck the Lusitania on the starboard side, just below the bridge. Passengers heard a muffled thud. The ship shuddered. Some thought it was a minor collision. Others felt a strange vibration through the deck. Then 10 seconds later, a second explosion tore through the vessel. This second blast was massive, far more powerful than any torpedo could produce. Survivors described it as catastrophic, like the entire forward section of the ship had detonated from within. The explosion ripped through multiple decks, demolished the bridge structure, and sent debris flying 100 feet into the air. The Lusitania began listing to starboard immediately. Not gradually, violently. 10 degrees. 15 degrees, 20 degrees. Passengers scrambled for lifeboats. Crew members tried to launch them, but the angle increased too fast. Lifeboats on the port side couldn't be released because they were hanging too far from the tilting deck. Lifeboats on the starboard side crashed into the hull as they were lowered, spilling screaming passengers into the freezing water. Captain Turner tried desperately to reach shore. He kept the engines running, hoping to beach the ship on the Irish coast just 11 miles away. But the forward momentum only forced more water into the massive breach in the hull. At 2:28 p.m., just 18 minutes after the torpedo struck, the RMS Lusitania slipped beneath the waves. 1,198 people died. Men, women, children, only 764 survived. The dead included 128 Americans. The world reacted with fury. Newspapers called it murder, cold-blooded slaughter. Recruitment offices across Britain were flooded with volunteers demanding revenge. Former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt demanded immediate war with Germany. President Woodrow Wilson, still committed to neutrality, issued stern diplomatic protests. Germany defended the attack. They claimed the Lusitania was carrying munitions, that she was a legitimate military target under international law, that Britain was using civilian ships as camouflage to transport weapons of war to the front lines. Britain denied everything. The Lusitania was an innocent passenger vessel. The cargo manifest showed commercial goods, cheese, furs, beef, nothing military. The second explosion must have been a boiler failure or coal dust ignition. Germany was lying to justify an atrocity. The British government launched an official inquiry led by Lord Mersey, a respected judge with experience in maritime law. His investigation lasted several weeks. Witnesses testified, evidence was presented. Documents were reviewed. Lord Mersey's final report concluded exactly what the British government needed it to conclude. The Lusitania carried no military cargo. The second explosion was caused by coal or boiler failure. Germany alone was responsible for the deaths of 1,198 innocent people. The report was published, the case was closed. But then something strange happened. Lord Mersey signed the report. Then he refused his payment for conducting the inquiry. He wrote a private letter stating he was not satisfied with the investigation. He never explained what troubled him. And he never spoke publicly about the Lusitania case again for the rest of his life. For 109 years, that official story held. Textbooks repeated it. Documentaries accepted it. Historians debated details, but never questioned the fundamental narrative. Until the drones went down in 2024. If you're still here, you've seen how 1,198 lives vanished in 18 minutes, and how Britain spent over a century protecting a story that survivors never believed. Comment below if you're following this investigation. And if you haven't subscribed, please do so and turn on the bell notification so you don't miss what comes next. Your support helps us uncover the truths that governments tried to sink 300 feet below the surface. Now, let's talk about what those cargo holds have been hiding since 1915. The Lusitania rests 300 feet below the surface, approximately 11 miles off the old Head of Kinsale, Ireland. Unlike the Titanic, which sits in international waters, the Lusitania wreck falls under Irish jurisdiction. For decades, that made investigation difficult. The Irish government designated it a protected site. Diving was restricted, salvage operations were forbidden. Anyone who went down risked prosecution, but divers went anyway. In 1982, American oceanographer Dr. Robert Ballard, who would later discover the Titanic, conducted a preliminary survey of the Lusitania. What he found troubled him. The ship had collapsed significantly. The bow was crushed inward, the stern was barely recognizable, and there were massive holes in the hull that no single torpedo could have created. The damage pattern suggested something had exploded from inside the ship. In 1993, Dr. Ballard returned with better equipment and more time. His team made a discovery that the official inquiry had never mentioned. Millions of rifle cartridges scattered across the debris field, not in sealed cargo containers, not packed in crates, loose, spread across the ocean floor like confetti. Brass casings glinting in the floodlights of the submersible. The British government issued a statement. These were commercially manufactured cartridges, not military cargo in the legal sense. The Lusitania had been transporting small arms ammunition for sporting purposes, perfectly legal. Then in 2008, divers discovered something that couldn't be explained away so easily. 4-inch artillery shells in the cargo holds. Not small arms ammunition, not hunting rifles, military ordnance. The kind used by British field guns on the Western Front. High explosive shells designed to kill soldiers in trenches. Thousands of them, still visible in the corroded wreckage. The British government maintained its position. The findings were taken out of context. The ammunition was commercially manufactured goods being exported before the war escalated. It wasn't military cargo that violated neutrality laws. But the 2024 expedition left no room for debate. A private research team funded by maritime historians deployed autonomous underwater vehicles equipped with ground-penetrating sonar and millimeter-wave imaging technology. These drones could see through sediment. They could map cargo holds that human divers could never safely access. They could detect chemical signatures of explosives that had been sitting in seawater for over a century. What they found was devastating. The scans revealed approximately 4 million rifle cartridges stored in the forward cargo holds. Not the few thousand mentioned in vague historical footnotes. Not a small shipment for commercial export, 4 million rounds of 303 ammunition manufactured specifically for the British military. But that was just the beginning. The penetrating sonar detected the unmistakable chemical signatures of high-explosive artillery shells. Not inert training rounds, not empty casings. Live ammunition containing TNT and other explosive compounds. The chemical composition matched British military specifications from 1915 exactly. These were weapons of war being shipped to the front lines. And then the researchers found what they'd been looking for. The second explosion, the one that killed most of the passengers. The one Britain blamed on coal dust or boiler failure for 109 years, it wasn't coal, it wasn't boilers. Naval engineers analyzed the scan data and reconstructed exactly what happened on May 7, 1915. The German torpedo breached the hull near the forward cargo hold. Seawater rushed in at tremendous pressure. The water reached the artillery shells stored in that compartment. The shells were unstable, they'd been improperly stored. The casings had corroded slightly during loading. When the cold seawater hit the explosive compounds, they detonated. Researchers estimate that between 50 and 90 tons of explosive material went off simultaneously inside the Lusitania. The force was equivalent to several tons of TNT exploding in a confined space below the waterline. That's why the second explosion was so massive. That's why survivors described it as catastrophic. That's why the Lusitania sank in 18 minutes instead of staying afloat for hours like similarly damaged ships. The British government had loaded a civilian passenger liner with enough military ordnance to supply an entire artillery brigade for weeks of combat. Then they sent it through a war zone where German U-boats were actively hunting. Then they put 1,962 people aboard without telling them what was in the cargo holds below their feet. Then they denied it for 109 years. Why would Britain do this? The answer is brutally simple. International law in 1915 was clear. Civilian ships carrying military cargo could be legally targeted by enemy forces during wartime. If the Lusitania was transporting munitions, then Germany's attack was justified under the laws of naval warfare. Britain desperately needed American support. They needed American outrage. They needed American factories, American loans, American soldiers. They needed the world to see Germany as the villain who murdered innocent civilians without provocation. Admitting the truth would have destroyed that narrative completely, so they lied. The cargo manifest was altered after the sinking. Witnesses who saw ammunition being loaded at the docks were pressured to stay silent. Lord Mersey's inquiry was carefully controlled to reach a predetermined conclusion. His doubts were suppressed, his objections were ignored. The official story became history, and 1,198 people died because the British Admiralty decided that shipping ammunition was more important than warning passengers what they were really sailing on. Captain William Thomas Turner survived the sinking. He testified at Lord Mersey's inquiry and was quietly blamed for not following proper evasive protocols. The implication was clear. If he'd zigzagged correctly, the torpedo would have missed. Turner died in 1933, maintaining until his last breath that his ship had been a legitimate passenger vessel. He never knew he'd been commanding a floating ammunition depot through a war zone. The families of the American victims sued Cunard Line for negligence. The courts awarded minimal damages, ruling that the passengers had assumed the risk by traveling through a declared war zone. No one mentioned that they had no idea what was really in the cargo holds. No one was ever held accountable. The RMS Lusitania was not a tragedy of war. It was a tragedy of deception. The German U-boat didn't sink her. The torpedo was just the spark. What sank the Lusitania was 90 tons of high explosives that Britain loaded into her holds, sent through a war zone, and swore didn't exist. What killed 1,198 people was a government that valued ammunition shipments over transparency, that prioritized propaganda over human life. The underwater drones didn't just map a wreck. They documented evidence that 3 governments have spent 109 years arguing about. And now that evidence is undeniable. Chemical signatures don't lie. Artillery shells don't disappear. Vermilion rifle cartridges don't manifest themselves through wishful thinking. For 109 years, Britain hid behind the story of an innocent ship murdered by German aggression. The truth is uglier and more complicated. The Lusitania was a calculated risk. The passengers were collateral damage. And when the gamble failed catastrophically, the cover-up became more important than accountability. History doesn't always bury its secrets in darkness. Sometimes it sinks them in 300 feet of water and hopes no one builds a drone sophisticated enough to find them. The RMS Lusitania finally told her story. It just took 109 years and technology that didn't exist when she went down. If this investigation revealed something you didn't expect, leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe for more stories where modern technology exposes the lies that history tried to hide, and stay tuned. The next video on your screen reveals another maritime disaster where the official story was just the beginning.